Hi everyone, welcome. These two bins right here were paired up soon after the launch of the younger system. Most cases I've got systems that are paired up that share the same start date, and in those cases I label the systems clearly as bins 1 and 2 since everything else is the same, the start date, the type of worm. Here there's a couple bins here that have, I believe, over a month difference in their ages. We got early October and then late to mid-November. So yeah, a little bit more than a month. Somehow the number 43 comes to mind, I think, was the difference in their ages. 13 days have passed now since we last checked in on these systems. And I'm definitely curious to see how the feeding from 2 times ago is coming along, because the last feeding went in, but what was interesting was the way the previous feeding had remained and was preserved, since it was a bunch of frozen cherry tomatoes and plum tomatoes that were put in here without having their skins burst. So during the last check-in we found a whole bunch of leftovers of tomatoes that were still unbreached. So each of those got popped last time, and what we did was we placed them inside of these shells of gourds. Well, the gourds don't have shells. The the gourd is just got its skin basically, and that's what I'm curious to see. So we're going to get these systems up on the bench and see how they're coming along. I got some other information to share about them with you as well up on my green board. So let's get started. So here we can see the age of the systems and how many times each bin was fed, and the gourds are now, what is that? That's 21 days, 3 weeks shy of 20 weeks, I believe. 17 weeks of those gourds being in here. And you know, it wasn't surprising that I referred to the skins of those gourds as shells, because they might as well be shells. They're so tough and thick. I spent a little time prior to using those gourds as worm food in these systems, soaking them. I submerged the gourds into water, and they soaked and soaked and soaked, and then I even went so far as to puncture the skin of each gourd in the hopes that some of the water that they were soaking in would seep inside and possibly start softening the material from both sides, inside and out. I have a serious amount of doubt that that did anything to help along the breakdown process. Because even now, after 17 weeks of being submerged in damp material with worms and microbes and all kinds of activity in here, geared at breaking the material down, you're going to see that they're still quite rigid and intact and probably not making a whole lot of progress. So it is what it is. We'll see what becomes of it. I have put gourds into my systems in the past. However, in that case, I think they were in the Vermibag Mini is where they were, yeah. I didn't really keep track of how much time elapsed from the time they went in until the present time. No, you know, at this point I think we haven't seen any signs of the gourds that were in the Vermibag Mini anymore. But it wasn't so long ago that we were still seeing signs of it. So let's dig in. Definitely curious to see how that tomato feast from 2 feedings ago looked. Last time we threw banana peel and coffee in here, but it is the tomato from 2 feedings ago that I'm curious to check in on. So, you know, these coffee filters that we used as feeding zone indicators last time can get used down in the feeding area as supplemental bedding to accompany the feeding, because I've got 2 more coffee filters that we could deploy as feeding zone indicators. On this side here, you could see potato peel, and over here what I did was I took I think it was 3 frozen banana peels, and I fragmented them to little pieces, because I like the way we took the leftover tomato from 2 feedings ago last time, and we placed them all inside of these gourds to try to promote worm traffic in and out of the gourds. And that's really what I'm interested in seeing. So right here we're already starting to see a portion of one of the gourds. These gourds, I don't know if you're familiar with what they are. They're like these little mini pumpkins that are used as decoration around the Halloween season and Thanksgiving time, mainly Halloween. And let's see here. Here's one of them. I mean, I think the gourds actually went in mainly intact. And then later on I came in here with a jackknife to kind of pick at them, and I was able to breach the skin and crack them open. And I guess that's part of the reason I think of them as more like shells rather than skins, because of the rigidity and toughness of them. So I am starting to squeeze the gourd here. In most cases I try to take interesting sort of test experimental materials and take care not to aid in the breakdown process, but with these gourds I'm more than happy to aid in the breakdown process, because that's really how they originated, which was me trying to soak them so that the breakdown process would be helped along with that soaking. So if I've got opportunities to crack away at these things, I certainly have no qualms about doing so. And it was kind of nice to be able to crack through the skin of this one over here. And even on this one you can see it's got this top, so I guess this would be the bottom, and that's probably where the stem of the object is. And that's kind of what we were seeing here, is the stem end, and then whatever was on the bottom of this particular gourd was the bulbous section. It is interesting to see how the worms like to crawl down into that little hollow. But I believe it is over in the younger system where we've got the somewhat larger, thicker skinned gourd, which I think is going to be far from the point where I'd be able to crack it, but we'll see. Doesn't hurt to remain optimistic and give the wormies the benefit of the doubt. I mean, we are now a few weeks into the spring. The official start of spring was a couple weeks ago, and the weather's definitely starting to warm up, and I believe the worms are beginning to react to the more favorable, warmer weather. And by that I just mean I think that their basic activity is going to start picking up as the temperatures rise. Here's the seed out of a mango, which up until the last check-in, or maybe it was 2 check-ins ago, that we were simply unable to make anything of it. It was just way too tough to be opened up, but finally it succumbed to the pressure of me squeezing on it, and it opened up. So now the worms have access to the inside of it. I was a little surprised to find no worms inside of it and find the seed quite intact still. So I think we've created sufficient space down here to place in today's feeding. These systems were definitely quite heavy when I brought them over to the bench here. And sometimes I wonder if it's just because of a large quantity of material in the system, or possibly just an abundance of moisture. And I think it's the former, because the moisture level doesn't seem excessive or anything like that. It seems just about right, actually. I think it is just the overall quantity of material in these systems that resulted in them being somewhat heavy. So in systems like these, where it feels like I'm nearing what I would consider to be the system's practical capacity, because the capacity would obviously be, you know, right up to the rim, but I consider there to be a practical capacity. So here's one of those really thicker, tougher gourds. Because as you can see, I like to excavate and pile stuff up, and for that you just need to leave yourself a little bit of space in reserve so that you can do that sort of stuff. And these are definitely systems that are in that category, leading me to feel like it would be probably a good idea to limit the amount of bedding that we place in here. Because even last time, you know, you could see a bunch of bedding was sprinkled out on the top surface in the form of leaves. Well, maybe I'm going a little overboard to say a bunch, because it probably wasn't a bunch. It was probably just sort of sprinkled out to give the system a nice appearance. But it was probably done sparingly to not drive us to a position where I've worked my way out of having space enough to work the way I like to work. So I think this right here is probably one of the bigger ones, if not the biggest gourd. And you can already see some of the tomato skins. The tomatoes fed 2 times ago. Here's one that hardly even got touched, where the inside of it was accessible, because every one of these tomatoes did get burst last time, but the worms have not quite done away with it yet. Look at all these worms hanging out inside the gourd. They just love their little gourd clubhouses, don't they? These little guys certainly hustle out of the bright lights. See, the majority of them are all right there. I believe one did actually fall off, but it was well inside the container. If it had been along the seam here, or the gap in between the containers, then I might have stopped with the gawking of that handful of worms and taken the time to get that little guy into a safe space before they end up dropping down between the containers onto the dry tablecloth and possibly into a hazardous situation. But luckily we were able to gawk at the little guys for a couple minutes there and enjoy the view. So yeah, some of these tomatoes still have their innards in them. As I break them open, there's still some juicy stuff inside. So unusual. Because I believe that now, geez, it's been what, 13 days is what it said since the last check-in, and I think during the previous check-in there had only been maybe 9 days. So we're talking about a few weeks since these tomatoes were placed in here. And for them to still be sticking around as leftovers to this degree is interesting to see. Okay, so let's get to feeding these little guys. Today I'm definitely going to back off when it comes to the installation of more bedding. Excuse me. The old coffee filter feeding zone indicators and whatever these are, maybe leftovers of one that came even prior, we'll just have to do as the foundational bedding that goes in prior to today's feeding. Because I just don't want to work myself into a position here where we don't have room to operate the way I like to operate. So that's just my executive decision today. And it kind of makes me wonder, if we're already this far along as far as the capacity of the systems, am I going to have to initiate the end of these systems at some point soon, possibly earlier than other bins that are older and more mature? It could very well happen. And I guess I wouldn't have any objection to that. I don't feel like I'm required to wait. If a system's ready to go, then it's ready to go. So you know what? I do have a couple soiled napkins over here, quite soiled. I guess just having a napkin or two nearby is often a nice handy thing to simply be able to reach over there and grab it in case something spills or needs to be wiped up. And maybe that's just me becoming a softie. There we go. We just gave them that much more bedding. Nothing to write home about, that's for sure. So the division over here was potato and banana peel, and it feels to me like if I just grab across, I'm going to get a little bit of each going down here on top of the paper that we just put in here as supplemental bedding to accompany the old feeding zone indicator coffee filter and this napkin. And got to remember all this leafy matter, which was kind of untouched practically because it didn't have the opportunity to get damp enough to promote worm activity on it. That stuff will also be extra bedding in my book, even though it's already been in here for a little while. And let's drop in their portion of coffee. Now, I guess there's something I've been doing here and there, which is to just skip the exploration of the outskirts of the systems. And by the outskirts, I just mean the the edges furthest away from the feeding zones, and a lot of times I do like to scoop down into there just to grab some material with which to cover up the feeding zone, and I guess it also offers us an opportunity to examine what's happening out there. So we'll do the same thing, pretty much resulting in the entire contents of the systems getting aerated and fluffed up and tilled up, which just by the nature of what's being done is going to, infuse a bunch of air pockets in the material all over the place, further bringing up the level of material in both systems. At first I was reluctant to commit to doing it. I thought that perhaps we would just leave the outskirts untouched on this occasion, so as to not push the envelope here in terms of bringing the level up that much more by aerating it, but I figured, let's just go for it. I do believe that aerating the material probably does the systems good, and I have on a few occasions recently skipped doing that, and I wasn't sure if this might have been one of the systems in which we just didn't do it last time, so it seemed like, just for the heck of it, let's do it. For no other reason, just to satisfy our curiosity about what's going on in these systems. So let's give the same treatment to the younger system over here. The younger system has in excess of 4,000 worms in here, and that's based on all of our estimates from the launch of the systems. Because every time I launch new systems, I do my best to show the population of worms that are being introduced into the new bins, and it's at that time I turn to the viewers, to you guys, to give me estimates of how many worms you believe were launched into a bin. And as I recall, the estimated population size of the older system is a little bit over 3,000, but the estimated population of here, this one, the younger system, is thought to be over 4,000 worms. So from time to time we do bump into worm parties that are pretty significant in size, which leads to fun check-ins when it comes to dealing with this pair of buddy bins. There's also a good bit of moisture in here, and at this point I believe that the heaviness of these systems is a combination of not only us approaching the capacity of the system, but also the ample moisture within each system. And yeah, we're definitely coming up to the rim on these systems. Today I'm going to forego the installation of any more leafy matter as top dressing today. They're getting a little bit of a skimpy application of bedding, a little piece of paper towel or napkin or whatever that was that went in there, in addition to the old feeding zone indicator. The new feeding zone indicators don't really register in my mind so much as bedding, although eventually they'll be used as such. And as you can see, I'm covering up pretty thoroughly here. It does seem to me like keeping the moisture level ample is one good way to make sure that the worms are comfortable and productive. And at some point closer to the finish line, we'll start driving things towards the point where we allow some of the system's moisture to be lost to evaporation. But for now, I think it's to our benefit to keep things nice and damp so that things can remain nice and active. So that's it for the check-in, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone, thanks so much for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.